Welcome to Behind the Muscle podcast. Today's guest is the owner of Integrated Muscle and Health. Today's guest is Austin Stout. Austin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey man, thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure, Austin. So I'm excited to chop it up with you, man. The first question that I have for you is, who are a few of your favorite bodybuilders of all time?
Favorite bodybuilders. Okay. So I would have to say for not only for muscle mass, but also personality, Marcus Rule, funny guy, very funny guy. He's very underrated in terms of his personality. I was able to meet him once. I can't remember. It was at an expo somewhere. He was a super cool, funny guy. And then, man, probably, I would also say I do like currently, I'll try to give a more current one. I do like Hadi Chupan currently. I think his, he's a fan favorite for sure, just because of the conditioning that he brings, so I do like him for sure.
Very, very cool. Those are two that don't always come up. So I like it, man. We're starting off on a good foot there. So,
Good.
Tell us, Austin, at what age did you start lifting weights? And then why did you kind of start lifting weights at that specific age?
Yeah. So I started weight training probably around, I would say regularly around 16, 17 years old for wrestling. So I was a wrestler. So it was because of that, because of the basically like off-season training. They offered it in school, right? We had a very generic strength program. I didn't go to a large high school or anything. So it's very, very generic, but I wanted to expand on that in the off season on my own. So I started researching. And then as I researched, almost all of the information I found was from bodybuilders at the time, right? And at the time it was magazine publications, pretty much. This is the only resources we had. And then later that evolved into forums, getting into the forums and stuff from there. But yeah, that's around that age, I would say.
Very cool. Now, since we're on the topic of forums, and some of the younger listeners won't even know what we're talking about, but some of the people that are more our age will know exactly what we're talking about. Did you have any like go-to forums, or did you have that one that you really spent a lot of time on, or can you not remember back that far?
Yeah, so the one that I was definitely on the most was RX Muscle for sure, hands down, because I did have an account on there, and I know I had a few like contest prep logs where I would log everything all the way through, and you would go in and update it, etc. I ventured out a little bit, Professional Muscle. More of like just an onlooker on a lot of those. I didn't really post, but on RX Muscle, I did post quite a bit.
Very cool, man. Very cool. All right. So I want to get a little bit more into your backstory, Austin, before we kind of get into the professional side of things. So talk to us about like where you grew up. You mentioned wrestling. Did you play other sports? Maybe talk about family dynamics. Did your parents have a big influence in your life? Any other maybe positive role models? Up to about high school, stop at high school, and then we'll transition into some other questions that I have for you.
Sure. So I'm from Ohio. It's a big wrestling state. Wrestling's pretty popular in Ohio, Pennsylvania, this kind of in all of like the New England states, because it gets cold in the winter. So a lot of people play winter sports, right? So that was, and I dabbled with football and different things. I didn't really enjoy any of it. And then I kind of latched on to wrestling, I think, because it's very individual sport. You're on a team, obviously, but it's largely an individual sport, right? So that's kind of why I gravitated towards that. Now, all growing up, I actually raced motocross my whole life, starting at about 8 years old, pretty much all over the country, even a little bit in like an amateur professional, like pro-am type of level later on in that. But then, once I was really serious with wrestling, that became more of a hobby that I did and less of a profession, I guess you should say. Now, as far as my upbringing goes, I I would say that I had a lot of push to be competitive from mostly from my father. He essentially rode my ass, my whole upbringing to just do the best that I could. Right. I wouldn't say necessarily in a harsh or abusive way, but he was always on me to do the best that I could. And that work ethic definitely translated when I was an adult. Right. And that's probably also why I gravitated towards those very individual sports where I had a lot of control over the outcome. Right. I wasn't really relying on other members of the team, so on and so forth. So I gravitated towards that individuality.
So now, talk about academics, because obviously you have your own business. You're a high level coach. Was academics when you were like in high school, when you're younger, something that you really enjoyed, or was that something again that maybe your dad kind of forced you to like focus on? Where were you at with that?
So I did well in school. So believe it or not, I had a lot of behavioral issues in school. So not necessarily, my grades were always good, but I had a lot of behavioral issues in the sense that I got very bored in school. So that phased out a little more as school got more difficult. I didn't find myself, quite as bored. And I also knew when to keep my mouth shut as I got older. But I did, after high school, I did go to college. So I did have a bachelor's in nutrition. Now I was actively personal training and coaching already before I really even finished college, pretty much right out of high school. So that was something where I was already going on it, and I wanted to complete it since I had it, most of the way done already. So I finished that out. And then, beyond that, that's the extent of my schooling. The rest is all the in the trenches,
Right.
experience.
So before we touch on college for a minute, I want to ask you a little bit more about childhood, or one more thing, Austin. Was there anybody else, outside of your dad pushing you kind of like really hard? Was there a coach? Was there a teacher? Was there another adult figure that you kind of look back on those years and you feel like they really had a positive influence or impact on your life that kind of maybe helped mold you into kind of where you're at today, or not per se?
I would say I had my surroundings were generally positive. I would say, my mom was always supportive. She was less understanding of the competitive aspect, but she was never not supportive. I would say. I had a great wrestling coach in high school. He was fantastic. I came from a big wrestling background. He was, really positive influence. We're still friends today. But I've always been very intrinsically motivated. The biggest thing was really just, when I was doing these individual sports, whether it be motocross, wrestling, or bodybuilding, you're in the spotlight in front of people kind of on your own. I didn't like to lose, it's like, well, my thought process was, if I make sure that I leave no stone unturned, I will not be embarrassed when I go and perform. Right. So that's where that kind of stemmed from. And of course that translates over into coaching as well. It all correlates at the end of the day.
So at what age were you kind of first exposed to bodybuilding? And what did you kind of think of it from the get-go? And then maybe just talk about, bodybuilding combined with you starting to coach, going to college, getting your education, and how those kind of just have molded together over the years.
Yeah. So there was a lot there probably in the late teens through early 20s, because I was going through the typical becoming an adult transition and dealing with all the typical growing pains, paying bills, all that stuff. Right. I was going to school. I had a full-time class load, which was however many credit hours was considered full-time. I had a full-time job, and I bodybuilded. So, I was doing all of these things simultaneously. And I would say my first exposure was probably, again, when I started weight training. I knew of it. I knew that there were people that competed in this, sport, if you want to call it that, which was bodybuilding. But for me, my interest grew as I continued weight training and actually saw my physique change. And so I decided that after I had completed wrestling, I actually started prepping for my first competition. And so I had a scholarship offer for wrestling for college. The school didn't really coincide with what I wanted to do. So I didn't take that offer. So actually that's kind of where my career there kind of stopped, but I actually started prepping for the first competition. I was still in high school. So, I was bringing my food in, weighed in my Tupperware containers to lunch, and with the high school kids and their pizza lunches and whatever else that they had. Right. So that was always an interesting conversation piece. So yeah, 17, 18 years old, first competition, I was 18, right on the cusp of turning 19.
So now, being that young and, prepping for your first competition, deciding in your mind as a 18-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old that, hey, like I'm going to do a bodybuilding competition. From my perspective, that takes a lot of just, again, that intrinsic motivation, discipline. And that's kind of a different mindset for somebody that age. So what was that thing that kind of like clicked in your mind at that age, Austin? And you're like, hey, I'm going to do a bodybuilding competition. Like, because most of us at that age, like I was getting ready to go off to college. Had my high school girlfriend, hanging out with her, partying, doing that. Like,
Right.
That's pretty normal. It's not really normal to prep for your first bodybuilding competition at 18. So what was it in your mind that's like, I'm going to do this. I like this. I'm going to try it. I'm going to go for it.
Yeah. So it really started in wrestling for sure, because I got really serious. I was there before practice, stayed after practice. I was not an athlete. I started as a fat kid, no athletic ability, trip over my own feet type of guy. Right. And then I developed into a good quality, wrestler by the end, which was mostly a product of just repetition and work. So that repetition and consistency was already kind of built in, right? And I was already doing a lot of the things in terms of, measuring food and weight training. Of course, when I wasn't doing wrestling conditioning, I was able to, my recovery and stuff, I was able to weight train more, of course, right? So I just continued to do it after the season had ended, and my physique was developing more because, of course, I wasn't getting beaten to the ground doing, hours of conditioning, right? So I thought, all right, well, let's try it. I had looked up and found some competitions in my state that offered a teen division, and decided that I was going to do it. Now, I will say that a lot of it also stems from in my early 20s, and well, probably prior to that, when I mentioned behavioral issues too, growing up, I was at some point, and I don't really recall when it was. I want to say probably in my late teens, early 20s, I was actually clinically diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Now, not like washing doorknobs, right? Not like not in that sense, but in terms of just extreme efficiency behaviors was kind of, and I didn't know at the time how to kind of harness that, right? Whereas now, being in my 30s, I've used those skills and also kind of know which ones are, which things are disadvantageous and don't use those things, right? But that, of course, that lifestyle, prepping, dieting, it feeds an addictive, an addict gravitate towards that. And I see it in coaching all the time. I get people that were ex-addicts or eating disorders, or right. Because why? Well, because it's structure and it feels at home. So the thing is, at the time, I didn't know that. I didn't know that because I hadn't fully realized to what extent my personality kind of went in that direction. But I quickly learned that after about 2 years of bodybuilding, when I started to run myself into the ground. Like, okay, so my issues are rooted in psychology, not physiology. So that's how I kind of learned. Bodybuilding actually was one of the things that showed me my faults, right? Trial by fire, kind of.
Okay. So before we go any further, that's why I really value these conversations with all of you athletes and coaches that come on the podcast, because it's more than just talking food and lifting and all the normal bodybuilding stuff. We get to kind of quote unquote get behind the muscle, right? So I want to ask you, because this kind of hit home for me. Not that I was ever clinically diagnosed with, OCD, but there's definitely been a lot of, I would say, anxiousness, and I call it like internal turmoil from a very young age. And it's been a struggle my entire life. And I know that, like you said, there's a lot of us within the bodybuilding community that maybe are attracted to this lifestyle because of some of that obsessiveness, right?
Sure.
So, when you said you got clinically diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, and I can't remember, how did you word it? Give us an example of like what something like extreme was in your case, please.
Perfect. Yeah. So I had actually seen therapists a lot growing up, and mostly from, it was mostly manifested as depression, but I later learned that depression was a secondary thing, right? It was a result of the OCD, essentially. And it was more depression when I was younger, and it kind of developed as I got more mature. It developed into that compulsiveness. Now, for me, and I don't know the exact professional terminology, but essentially, perfectionism is what the therapist kind of coined it as, right? Now, an example would be, I'll give you an example, like at the worst, peak chaos, right? So this was, probably early 20s when I was actively bodybuilding, school, so on and so forth, work, right? It would be to a point where I was learning these like efficiencies in my routine, because I was learning about things like sleeping enough and doing all these things. So I'm like, well, how can I fine tune? So it got to the point where I might not walk across my apartment to do something unless I needed to do 2 or 3 things on that side of the apartment. At the time, we're talking like a 600 square foot, little hole in the wall, right? So that's obviously a really deleterious behavior, of course. And then it developed into like, well, I can't go see my family because it's a waste of time, because I could probably do this instead, or whatever. So there was about a year period. And at this time, I didn't realize that I had run my hormones into the ground. So of course I felt like shit, right? There was probably a year period where I didn't leave my apartment except to train. And I worked at the gym that I trained at, right? And to go to the grocery store, which was across the street from the gym. I did not go one single place outside of those 2 places for an entire year, right? Probably one of the worst years of my life, right? Now, I realized that I had some health events, at a pretty young age so that was kind of an awakening moment that I understood why, because I was eating good and so on and so forth. So, and I realized that this was a psychological issue at its core. And that's actually what brought me into the whole functional health side of things, and kind of like coupling that with bodybuilding and physique enhancement. And so I was probably I'm sure I was one of the earlier people, because now it's a pretty functional health is definitely coming about. I'm sure I was one of the earliest people in that kind of realm, back in 2011, 12 area.
All right. First of all, thanks for, just keeping it real with us, sharing a little bit about
Sure.
that, because I know that'll hit some people like it kind of hit me. Now let's transition. So we have to be a little sensitive to time, so I don't want to get too deep into the backstory. We touched on it good enough for now, but I want to kind of speed up a little bit. So you mentioned you did go to college, you got your the Bachelor of Science in Nutrition Science, but you said that you kind of started coaching even before college or during college. So why don't you talk about that? Was it kind of more like online prep coaching, bodybuilding coaching? What type of coaching was it? How did you get into it? How did you learn? Just unpack that, because then I want to transition to kind of more of the functional health and where you're at today.
Sure. So, time frame wise, right? Online coaching was I could count the number of online coaches that I knew at the time. I mean, on one hand, there were probably more, but it was extremely scarce. So I started at the time, you started with personal training in the gym. That's what people did, right? Um, Now I was in that scene. I actually had kind of worked my way up. I was like the head, the head trainer at the gym, overseeing whatever, right? And I had saw this need for nutrition, of course, because I already knew the importance of it from my own bodybuilding and wrestling. And of course, no one else was talking about it in the gym, right? So really, I started just helping people for free, no additional charge of, the clients that I already had or friends or family or whoever. So my first paying client for nutrition was probably around 2000, probably around like 2010, I guess, ish, somewhere. I started personal training at actually like right at 18, that summer that I came out of high school. So, 2009. But so right in that range is when I started. Then I realized that word of mouth, right? I started to understand the importance of word of mouth and the internet, because Instagram started in 2010, I believe. I didn't have an Instagram at the time, but we had Facebook, and I was starting to document some things on Facebook and not just on the forum. And people would start messaging me, right? And I thought, whoa, they want to pay me for this. So of course, at the time, we're talking like $50 a month or something for whatever it costs, right? And that turned into, and at the time, 2010, I've done 2 shows already. So I had some practical experience, and I prepped myself for both of them. I'm pretty sure the first 2. Second one, I got a lot better shape than the first one. But long story short, people started paying, and then it developed into, by 2000, I would say by probably like 12, that was my main, that income surpassed my personal training income. So, my whole adult life, I've been self-employed, right? That's all I've ever done. I think I had one part-time job where I worked at like a supermarket there, like when I was still in high school, like those last few months, before I graduated. But outside of that, I've been self-employed the whole time. But never did I realize, never did I think that that would be a viable career. So actually, in college, my initial major I was a health major, but I was either going to go into psychology, which I was kind of on the fence about because it was an 8-year degree and I didn't pay as good as I wanted to for going to school for 8 years, and or physical therapy. Okay. And at the time, physical therapy was actually a master's degree and not a PhD. They had kind of switched it, and that kind of turned me off to it, not because of the work necessarily, but because I was always cognizant of like, hey, going into debt, this much money, and the job. But like I said, by the time I got to my second or third year in college, I was already self-sustaining coaching pretty much.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Now, was there a point, Austin, kind of like when you started, posting some results on Facebook, people start DMing you, you start, making a little money here and there from the coaching, and then it kind of starts, the ball really starts rolling. I mean, at what point did you kind of like realize like, man, like this may be a sustainable financial opportunity for me, not only now, but as long as I want it to be? Was there kind of a moment where you kind of realized like, hey, like this is the direction I'm going. I can go all in. It's going to pay all my bills. I'm going to be able to have a great living. Was there a moment or not?
I wouldn't say there was an exact moment, but there were milestones along the way. I quit the personal training job. That was a big one. That was, a big step, right? Because I didn't have that more consistent income coming in, whereas coaching can be kind of a little up and down. So that was a big milestone. And then probably when I hit a point where I was just not as worried financially. Now that took a while, I think, because that's just the way that I was raised. I would say my parents were frugal. Right. So even as my dad is a very savvy guy in terms of like rental properties. He does all kinds of stuff, right? But he was still, even then, he was very frugal. So I was always kind of cognizant of that. But there was definitely a point probably around 2013, I would say, where I'm like, yeah, this is it, and that was probably towards the end of getting ready to graduate from college. And I knew that I kind of ruled out the psych degree. I ruled out the PT degree. And then I had, focused on the nutrition aspect, and I was all in at the time with that. And frankly, there also came a point where I thought, I'm broke anyhow, and I have nothing to lose. So if this doesn't work, then we're back to square one again, So that was also a realization that I came to at some point.
Perfect. Okay. So before we kind of just fully dive into coaching, and I have a couple specific questions related to that, I want to talk about kind of your personal bodybuilding experience / journey, however you kind of want to word that. So you competed when you were 18, then you mentioned your second show. Why don't you talk about just kind of like, a little bit of your competition history? Are you still competing? What are your like ultimate long-term goals in terms of bodybuilding for yourself? Just talk about that a little bit, and then we'll finish up with a little bit more in-depth coaching talk.
Sure. Yeah. So the competing's always kind of been in chunks. I did 2009, 10, and 11. I think I took a couple years off, then did a few more in a row and a few more. So I've done a total of 13 shows, I think, ish, which for a male bodybuilder, it's not bikini, you can't sneak in quite as many. It's a good amount, right? So I've competed at, I've done teen, lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight. And ultimately, I have not competed since 2019. And I've been trying to progress to where I really want to see what I can do as a heavyweight. And that's kind of my end game. Realistically, I mean, genetically, once you get to a certain point, the progress becomes so difficult. And I have a really good grasp genetically on what kind of my responses are and what my personal comfort zone is with things, right? So I've competed at different levels, regional shows. I did 2012, I think it was. I did the Team Universe, which at the time they actually were drug testing the top 5 guys in all the open classes, because they had the IFBB World Championships, and they were sending people, right? So I placed at that. I think I got 4th there, and it was a competitive at the time. They actually had like a pretty big turnouts, right? Fast forward, I did Junior USA in 2019. So you consider that a national show, I suppose. I've won three or 4 overalls at regional level shows. So those are kind of like peak achievements, I suppose.
For sure. Yeah. So, I mean, do you have any aspirations of trying to gun for a pro card, or is that just something that's not even really in your mind at all?
Realistically, I'm a very realistic guy, not to the point where I'm pessimistic necessarily, but I know genetically, and in the last 3 years, I have eaten my face off and trained till, it's so, and I know what progress I've made. So realistically, I don't know that I have the capacity to gain the size I need to go to a national level, like NPC nationals. And now, could I get a first call out based on structure and conditioning? Probably. On a good day, probably. But the end of first call out and top 1 or 2 is a whole different ball game. There's a gap there, right? Now, that's not to rule out doing masters nationals if I sustain things pretty well, because now I do sustain the muscle pretty easily now. Realistically, I don't, just because I think I've come up so slowly over time that I don't really have an issue sustaining the tissue. So I wouldn't rule out doing something like Masters Nationals, in a couple years. So if it happens, it will happen there.
And you know what, man, I know a lot of guys that come on the podcast and, you know, they're, yeah, I'm 35, so I'm a few years older than you, but you know, a lot of the guys that come on the podcast, they're still pretty young. Like, you know, I think they kind of look down at the masters level, but
It's
hey,
okay.
you know what? There's been some dudes that have turned pro, you know, in the masters division, and they're winning shows and going to the Olympia. So you know what? It is what it is. I love the statement. I don't know who said it, probably a lot of people, but you know, the statement of like, it doesn't matter. Nobody remembers, you know, where you got your pro card. It's like, what did you do with your pro card? Right. And I love that statement because, dude, when you're competing in the IFBB Pro, it's like nobody's walking up saying, "Hey, bro, like, are you the Mr. USA or Mr. Nationals, or did you get it at?"
Not that I'm aware of.
Like, no, nobody cares, right? Nobody cares at all. So, anyways, now I want to ask you one quick question in terms of training, Austin. Has your training over the years kind of evolved? If so, kind of like where are you at right now in terms of your training? What do you think is kind of like maybe the best way to train in terms of hypertrophy, bodybuilding, if you were going to say there is a best way?
Yeah. Oh man. So I've tried everything, right? Heard that one before. So probably the biggest factor that's changed is as I've gotten more muscular and stronger, I've had to change just because of the poundages and stuff that I'm using in the gym. So for example, now for me to do like a barbell squat or an RDL, the amount of nervous system taxation it takes to unrack that bar and set up and do those couple of work sets is not the return on investment is not good. So I've definitely gravitated more towards a lot more braced movements now. I'm doing a lot more braced movements, like, you know, leg movements, things like hack squats and pendulum squats and leg presses and things versus a free weight barbell squat, and training in more braced scenarios where I can really take the poundages and isolate that tissue a lot better. And it's a lot easier on my nervous system. Right. So that would probably be the biggest thing that's changed in my training, especially in the last few years. And I've gotten better results, I would say, by doing so. Volume, you know, I've done all kinds of stuff. I've done the actual pure to the book DC training, the, you know, AB split 3 days a week. I got really good results with that. I did. But I got to a point of strength where it really became a question of like not getting hurt. You know, it just, and not even so much during the movements, but like setting up for a movement, like getting in place with 170-pound dumbbells. You know, it's like, well, that's tedious. It's a lot. There's a lot that can go wrong. So that was kind of where the training had evolved. And now I actually train, I combined a lot of things. So I would say it's probably most closely relatable to like fortitude training, which from Dr. Scott Stevenson. So I do a mixture of like progressive overload and also metabolic work, which, you know, higher reps, muscle rounds, cluster sets, stuff like that. So I do a kind of a combination of that.
Excellent. Now, I was on your Instagram because I like to try to, you know, do some sort of prep before I have a conversation with somebody.
Sure,
and
you found.
Sometimes it's easier to get material, you know, for the conversation from people's Instagram than other people. But now, do you train out of a garage?
So it's more of a barn than a garage.
Okay.
So it is a pole. It's a big pole building, right? So there's a story behind that. I used to own a gym and sold the gym, and the property that we lived at the time had this pole building, right? So I actually rented it. It was one of my dad's rentals. So we were renting the house, and I thought, you know, I'm not going to sell all the equipment. I sold off a lot of like the Nautilus commercial stuff that was worth some money, and took the rest of it back to this barn essentially. And that's where I have trained for probably the last 6 years, nonstop, 5 to 6 years. I have no electricity. So I run an extension cord from my house all the way out to the barn to plug in a fan and like a couple of lights, just enough to where I can see. It's brutally hot in the summer and it's brutally cold in the winter. But I will say that, and I've added a lot of equipment over the years, and I have some cool stuff. Like I have a belt squat, a pendulum squat. I have, T-bar rows, all kinds of bands, chains, every bar. Like I have a great setup, but it's not for the faint of heart. It is a very unforgiving place.
Dude, I love it. Now, does it have any sort of concrete flooring, or is it all dirt floor? Because I saw dirt floor in it too.
It is concrete, but it's very old. So the concrete's very uneven and chipped and chunky. It also has pretty poor drainage, so it floods like twice a year. So I've trained like with boots on before, where it's like I have water, like 3 or 4 inches of water up on my ankles.
I love it.
I've trained in there with, a couple of weeks. June was really, really hot, right? So our June was brutal here in Ohio. There was several days, like when we have a lot of humidity, there were several days with heat indexes like 105, 110. And it's tough in there on those days. I train by myself some. I have another guy that comes out some. A lot of people are like, hey, I like to work out by myself. I'm like, well, you like to work out by yourself in a commercial gym when there's people watching you, right? So come out here and work out by yourself. It's a whole different ball game.
Dude, I absolutely love it, because honestly, I own a gym. I'm here in Iowa. I found out pretty quickly though, after I bought the gym, I can't train in my own gym because, people want to come up and talk to you. And it's like, it just,
sure.
I'm sure you get it. But so I train out of a garage. I train out of a two-story garage. Mine isn't quite as hardcore as yours, but let me tell you, dude, I do love training out of that garage because it's nitty gritty, and I don't have any machines. It's a squat rack, it's barbell, it's dumbbells, it's all the basics, but it's just me. And I love training by myself. And it's just like, I just go into that garage, dude, and I just get lost. There's no distractions. I don't have my phone with me. There's nobody else. It's just, I'm not doing anything to impress anybody. It's me, the weights, and are you going to get the work done, Quentin, or you're not? So I saw that. I was like, dude, I like this guy. If this is where he's training all the time, I like him a lot, because it's different, dude. Nowadays, bodybuilding, fitness, working out, gyms, it's different than it used to be. And I don't want to go into that direction, but I love it, man. I love that you're training there. It's different, and it's cool. So let's transition. Let's finish up. Talk to me about integrated muscle and health. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? How are you different, Austin, in terms of your coaching than maybe some of these other coaches that we see, pimping themselves on Instagram?
Sure. So the name officially was in LLC'd, I guess, as you could say, in probably 14. And so I had a coaching business. I just paid my taxes under Austin Stout, sole proprietor, whatever. Right. And then I was like, I need a name. I need a business name. So I developed that name out of, obviously, muscle being the bodybuilding aspect, but the integrated health portion I was really targeting that functional health aspect of it as well. So I wanted something that encompassed that without being too extremely wordy. And that's what I came up with at the time.
So break down functional health. Obviously, some people watching, listening to this will understand what that is. Some others won't. But so break down functional health, and then again, kind of like touch on how you coach differently, maybe from other people, other prep coaches, so to speak.
Okay. So functional health, I think some people that don't know about it might get the idea that it's kind of like this very hippie, weird thing. There maybe are aspects of it that are kind of holistic, and you would kind of view it that way, but functional health is rooted in science. It's just that if we think of general medicine, it's very reactive, right? You have a problem, that's already developed. You go get it, a medication for the symptoms, right? Whereas functional health, there is some of that, right? Because people are coming to you with an existing issue, but the idea is functionality, optimizing function first, and that way you optimize results, right? So some people, it's minor stuff. Like I actually work with a lot of even bigger male bodybuilders now, and a lot of these guys don't realize the carryover. They think functional health is like women and menstrual cycles and digestion and stuff. Well, I'm like, yeah, but what happens when you're pounding down 6,000 calories and taking PEDs and beating the shit out of yourself? You better believe there's a functional health aspect to that. So they're amazed when they start getting better results. Because why? Because they function better, right? So yes, now the business has developed into this, like, I work with these really rough cases where people are having a lot of different ailments, and and sometimes that's me working side by side with the doctor. It can be a lot of different kind of scenarios. But also I do work with the physique enhancement crowd, where they maybe have done a prep and they're having some issues post prep, and we're sorting these things out so we can have that productive off season, or we can have that better contest prep next time. And then what happens a lot of the time is they stay with me and they realize that, man, if he can optimize that, he can optimize my prep, and then he can optimize my result. So, a big issue with, especially, and this is males too, but a big issue in the female crowd is just shelf life. Like females, the turnover is just, they're gone, they're in and out. And at the pro level, you see it all the time. But at the amateur level, but at the pro level, you see it maybe slightly less because they're genetically are so good. So they get away with a little bit more. But at the amateur level, it's just like, they're just churning them out. I mean, the shelf life on a female competitor is nothing. They do a few competitions, their body's wrecked. They generally fall out of love with the sport because of the issues that they have, and they're out, right? So, for me, also helping people realize their full potential by extending that shelf life, right? It's like, hey, maybe it will take us an extra year to reach whatever said potential is, but now you can actually sustain that and continue to get results for the next 10 years versus hating bodybuilding 2 years from now, right? So functional health encompasses a lot of things. I mean, I do so many different types of specialized testing and different protocols and a lot of stuff. And now there's definitely a huge like psychology component to it that comes into it. So that's something I talk to a lot of people about. Even some of like the guest that we were talking about, my client Felix, we had some diet. Felix, huge dude, right? That requires a lot of food to sustain. That's not easy on your digestive tract, right? And so there were some issues that had popped up digestion wise. And as soon as we sorted that out, it was like a switch, right? Now he's optimized, right? The result in the off season and so far in this prep were night and day different than the last time, as far as like what we've needed to do, in terms of like bringing calories down and cardio and stuff. This prep's been night and day different than the last one. So bodybuilding guys, like, it's hugely important, but I think it's one of those things where half the guys are afraid to even look at their blood work. They don't want to know. Out of sight, out of mind.
For sure. And we're going to touch on Felix here in a minute. And he actually really opened up on that podcast, because I when he mentioned some things, he alluded to some things. I said, hey, in my mind, I'm like, okay, we're going to dig a little bit deeper because there's something here. So he really opened up, and he said that he didn't share things with you until after the competition, because he knew you're so health conscious that you would have pulled the plug on that prep. So he really opened up. Those of you that are watching, listening to this, go to the previous episode 155, listen to Felix Norman. He's a few weeks out from North Americans, where I believe he probably will be getting his pro card. So listen to his episode. I want to talk about Felix here in a minute, But again, because of time, I want to ask you, because I think this is going to add a lot of value to those who are watching, those who are listening to this specific episode with you, Austin. You mentioned kind of PEDs. I think there's probably a lot of people that watch this, listen to this, that have or are currently taking PEDs. And how do PEDs really change the dynamics of our makeup as a human being? How can they really be detrimental in the long term in terms of our health and our competing, our longevity? What are some of those things that you really see with those enhanced athletes that come to you?
Yeah, so if males and females will have different issues, women are more the virilization, masculinizing side effects, menstrual cycle, fertility, things that they're going to run into, right? And unfortunately, a lot of those virilization side effects are pretty much permanent. So that's something I talk about, like, are you okay with that, right? Now in males, we're dealing with a lot more muscle mass. We're dealing with like cardiac function, renal function. Those are the two biggies, right? And they feed into each other. So it's normally kind of weakest link thing. When you hear about an event, somebody has a big health event, it's either, hey, they have stage 5 renal failure, or they had a heart attack, or whatever. And but it's usually one of those two things kind of gives out first, right? Now there's obviously a genetic component to that as well. But in this population, a lot of what we'll see is like enlargement of the heart, right? And you get some of that from getting bigger in general. A cardiologist will be able to kind of tell you if it's normal athlete's heart or if it's an abnormal enlargement. They're pretty good at deciphering that. And then also under functioning, so like ejection fractures becoming too low, so the heart's not pumping efficiently, and then that puts strain on the kidneys, or vice versa. You have high blood pressure for a really long time and the kidneys underfunction, so that puts strain on the heart. So a lot of these things are, and if you add the PEDs into it, obviously that's just kind of accelerating the size portion of it, which is putting additional strain. Heart needs to work harder, right? Now, there are going to be a lot of kind of context and sub factors that go into that, because reality is there are a lot of guys that are really big that don't need a lot. And then vice versa, there are a lot of guys that are kind of mediocre that take a lot, right? So it's a combination of factors, for sure. The biggest thing really is that a lot of these things are outside of like rare things like clotting disorders or something like that. It's detectable, right? Blood pressure is very easy to monitor for sure. Things like doctors are kind of hard to get them to play ball on some things, I understand, but doing things like a calcium score to look at blockages, extremely easy and cheap procedure. Echocardiogram to look at, functionality of the heart. Checking your BP, having an echo and a calcium score, those 3 things alone would save, lives across the board, 100%, because we can monitor, because kidney function, we're monitoring on lab work pretty easily anyhow. So we can monitor all of those big hitters with relative ease. Those are non-invasive procedures. I had both of those done a couple years back just for kind of peace of mind. Luckily, my doctor's awesome and he would refer them for me. But we can see those things and we can make proper adjustments. Now, is there a way? A great question is usually like, is there a way that you can maximize result and minimize risk? I think that's what most people want to know, because they're like, hey, how can I still do this and not get this side effect? And so that's how the whole what would they call it? The whole lower risk model has kind of come about. Some people kind of talk about this. So the short answer is you can certainly minimize result or minimize side effects and still get good results. The biggest issue is probably that is patience, is people just if your genetic ceiling is here, you can get here in 2 years, or you can get here in 5 years. You getting here in 5 years is going to have a dramatically different result on your health than you trying to get here in 2 years, right? And that's kind of the biggest takeaway is you're probably going to get from point A to point B regardless, because it's so largely rooted in your genetics that if you were to just be a little more patient, you could get there in a more reasonable fashion, and it's probably going to lower those risks quite a bit. So that's a good takeaway for people, I would say.
1000%, man. Thank you. Okay, last thing here, and then we'll wrap it up because I know you've got some other things going on. Going back to Felix Norman, when did you start working with him? How excited are you for him in terms of this prep and going into North Americans here in just a few weeks?
Oh, Felix is a good dude. I have several clients that are what I would call, and I love all my clients, but there's different personality types that kind of lend themselves to being productive in terms of being a bodybuilder. He does a really good job with giving me the keys and letting me drive, right? And that's really the key to success with coaching at the end of the day, is not overthinking yourself to oblivion, right? So yeah, super nice guy. I couldn't be more excited for him. It was great to see him at USA's last year, kind of make a big splash, and then much improved again this year. So you never know who's going to show up, but his presence will be known at the very least.
He's a big dude, and I think there's definitely a bright future ahead with him. How long have you guys been working together then?
Probably a few years, I would say. So funny thing is, he came to me for bodybuilding, but he was actually very much a functional health client. I mean, we've worked through, so we'll put it this way. His approach is 100% more sensible now, and his results are 100% better. So we'll say that. And we fixed quite a few things along the way, both in the digestive realm and some other areas. And it's made just a drastic difference, because you take someone like Felix who has genetics for muscle and you give him a good environment. It pains me though, because I see a lot of guys online and I'm like, man, if you would just fix these few things, you're missing a lot. You're leaving a lot in the tank there. But
Excellent. All right, Austin, where can people connect with you? Where can people find out more about integrated muscle and health? Any final thoughts, any final words? Instagram, all those things. The platform is yours. I'll do a quick outro and that'll be a wrap.
Cool. Yeah. So Austin Stout on Facebook, and Instagram is Austin ST, the number 8. I have a link tree in the bio. So the link tree will take you to my podcast, my YouTube, my emails in there for coaching inquiries. I also run a mentorship program for coaches for an education platform. So all that stuff's there. If you have any questions, email is a really easy way to get me. I sit in front of this damn computer all day, so you can find me.
Perfect, man. All right, Austin, I really appreciate your time. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yep, you're very welcome. All of you who are tuning into Behind the Muscle podcast, I appreciate you. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube, and also take this episode with Austin, share it on your Instagram stories. Make sure you tag Behind the Muscle, tag Austin. That would be greatly appreciated. And then finally, I will leave you all with this. Remember, behind the muscle, there's always a story. We'll catch you guys later.